and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I have been inspired by a friend of mine when I was having a conversation this past weekend about things we see on social media and a phenomenon that seems to be very prevalent and troubling that's going on in social media. And this is kind of about the complexities of mental health and our interpersonal dynamics in today's digital world and how they're starting to clash. And it's really starting to get to the point now where it's becoming a status quo. People are almost maybe presuming they need to do this. And the phenomenon I'm talking about is trauma dumping. And its true impacts on the relationships with maybe their followers, their family, or even their loved ones in their relationships. Now, trauma dumping, it's a term that's become increasingly prevalent in our social discourse more and more. It really refers to this act of unloading our emotional burdens and problems onto others without their consent or their consideration. And now, it's quite interesting that we have to frame it this way. And the reason why is because, especially in something like the lifestyle where we constantly talk about consent, if we are reading somebody's troubling story, and I'm also going to be talking about today the difference between, venting and trauma dumping. But when they're dumping their emotions online, people are looking for validation. They're looking to do these things, and there's no real consideration for the people who may come across these posts and what they think of them. Now, it's really a behavior that can manifest both in face-to-face interactions, and it's definitely it's on the rise over the last few years, especially given platforms like TikTok, where individuals feel emboldened to overshare without fully comprehending the repercussions of what they're saying. Now, people will do all these things like trigger warnings and, heavy content incoming. That's fine, but it still doesn't, that's not a pass just because you're putting it out there. You're still not really realizing the impact of what you're saying on others. Now, as I kind of go through this show today, I really want to get into the subtleties of trauma dumping. I want to expand its definition. I want to talk about how it's different from healthy venting. I want to explore its effects on relationships potentially and, look at some of the ways we can actually address these problems that we are facing ourselves in a much healthier manner, so it's not reflective of our behavior. So let's really start with this today by understanding a little bit further what trauma dumping is. Now, it's a term that over the last probably about the last 5 to 10 years, has really gained a lot of traction. I mean, if you look at hashtags, we see links to it on X. I'm not on TikTok, but I mean, it didn't take me long to do a quick search in Google and pull that up. And there was probably about 400 videos, and it was real quick. I'm sure there was more to it. But this is really an act of unloading your emotional problems onto others. And it's a trend that I see with a lot of different mental health issues. I don't want to go into today about the complexities of dissociative identity disorder either. I'm not an expert in that field. I don't even want to talk about these people calling things systems and alters. That's just a ridiculous notion. I'm going to cover that in a different show, but this is kind of along the same lines. We're sitting here and telling people our problems, what we're facing, what's going on, and we're really not very concerned on the effects of when people are going to either listen to what we're having to say or when they're about to read some emotionally charged story that we're putting out there. And again, I want to emphasize it's very important to differentiate here between trauma dumping and healthy venting. And venting is more about expressing your emotions in a balanced and conversational manner. Sorry, my words aren't working well today. Now, while venting really does serve as a cathartic release for some of us, we've had a frustrating day at work and just want to talk about it for a little bit, maybe sit down and watch some TV or have a nice dinner. Trauma dumping differs with in its main functionality of they don't care if the person's boundaries or emotional well-being is going to be affected. They're just going to sit there and unload on you about whatever the issue seems to be. Now, this behavior is not confined to just maybe telling our partners or telling our friends or even our family about this, but with the explosion over the last 15 years of social media, it's really started to take its prevalence there. Now, with anonymity and the perceived distance afforded by our online communications, such like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or FetLife, whatever, individuals really can feel emboldened to overshare without really seeming to care what they're saying to others. And what begins as maybe a genuine attempt to seek support or validation really evolves, or more so, it quickly devolves into a cycle of toxic oversharing and exacerbated feelings and isolation and alienation. Because more often than not, the more you're talking about these memories and you're unloading them, they are there forever now that you put them out there. You're not really escaping the problem. You're not working it through in a healthy manner. The harm caused by trauma dumping is it's tiered here. It affects the dumper and the listener. Now, for the dumper, it can perpetuate a cycle of emotional dependence, where I need the validation of others every time I'm feeling bad. And I no longer can be taking any proactive steps to address the issues that I'm having because I need the validation of people I don't even know or I'm not close with, or just follow my interactions to get through it. Now, on the other hand, the listener, or the reader for that matter, may experience feelings of, they may feel like they're overwhelmed. They might feel a lot of discomfort from what they're reading or hearing. Even secondary trauma is possible because they are forced to bear that emotional weight of somebody else's burdens. Now, I do this, that's what I do for a living. And we're trained to do it and trained to cope, and we have our mechanisms afterwards. But for many people on this planet, that's not what they do for a living. So trauma dumping really undermines the fundamental principle here of healthy communication and damages interpersonal relationships. Because what we're really saying is, I don't care about your boundaries. And I don't care how my words are going to impact you. I'm, in essence, perpetuating the same cycle of emotional imbalance and resentment that erodes the trust and intimacy that I've felt potentially. And I'm doing that with others. Because I'm secondarily putting them in my world, and then maybe they never had problems and they're questioning things now just because of what they've read. Now, is that repercussion fair to anybody else? It's not. And we have to learn to recognize the detrimental effects and work towards maybe curtailing this behavior. Unfortunately, I don't believe it's going to stop. TikTok has become a big bastion of this, but even on places like fetish.com or definitely on FetLife, you don't really go a day without seeing people's emotional dumping because they want to vent. They're using the social media for that validation. They're using it as their therapy, but it's not helping you in the manner you think it is. It's literally making things worse. Now, how does trauma dumping affect our relationships? It extends far beyond the individual person sharing those emotional burdens, because we do want to listen to our partners. We want to be there for them. But it does strain the bond, and it creates distance between people. Because if all I'm doing is coming home every day, or when my partner comes home every day, and all they are doing is dumping their emotional loads on me every day in, day out, they're not even asking about me. They don't seem to care about how I feel. That starts to strain the relationship. Now, what may begin as a genuine attempt to seek support tends to quickly spiral into a one-sided dynamic where the dumper monopolizes the entire conversation. And they don't really care that their partner is feeling overwhelmed or unheard or not even cared for or unsupported. And for the person who's on the receiving end, the emotional impact is profound. They're helpless. They might even feel resentment as they're forced to navigate that dark waters of somebody else's trauma without being adequately prepared to deal with it. And that emotional burden takes the toll on their mental health. And it strains the very essence of the relationship. At its core, we start creating doubt or resentment. And it leads to feelings of being withdrawn and sullen inside of the relationship. In essence, here, trauma dumping undermines the foundation of something that's healthy and supportive. Because by prioritizing their own need for validation and sympathy over the well-being of their partner, the dumper, the person who's doing this, perpetuates that cycle that ultimately destroys the respect and the closeness that they've built. And for a genuine connection to be built on respect and empathy, we have to understand that the detrimental effects here of trauma dumping and don't strive to make a relationship stronger. They literally are eroding each step of what we've built. We have to be able to listen to our partners. If we couldn't come in and go, oh, I've had a bad day. My boss yelled at me. You vented. You said your piece. But maybe you turn to your partner and you say at this point, how was your day? So we're actually actively engaging with them. Maybe they're going to come back and ask us about what our boss said. But if not, and this is kind of a perfect example, if I come in and just start saying, oh, my boss yelled at me, and I start going into it, trauma dumping here leads to this breakdown in communication and trust. Because if I'm monopolizing for the next 2 hours how my boss did this to me, or I'm talking to my friend how my partner broke up with me, you have one person consistently dominating the conversation with their own trauma. And it doesn't allow any space at all for any reciprocal sharing. And the more that this imbalance tends to breed, it starts to create frustration, resentment. Over time, there's really nothing left. John's going to call me because he wants to come over and talk. And, all I've been hearing about for 6 weeks is how bad things are for John. And we get turned off. And you can probably think when I'm saying some example like that, I understand John is going through something very difficult, but maybe John needs to seek professional help or some other things that I'll get to a little bit later that can start to help them alleviate that pain. Because otherwise, if I feel like John's going to come over and just keep doing this, I'm going to get disconnected. I'm sure as hell going to feel alienated. And I'm just not going to want to be around him. And the worst part is when John's doing something like this, by the way, John's just a name I grabbed out of the air. It's not a real person. It's making his mental health issues worse. And it's creating additional stressors within that relationship between John and myself. I don't want to be subjected, day in and day out to repeated trauma dumping and feel like there's nothing I can do to help them. So you've made me feel helpless in our relationship. It makes me feel inadequate, less than, because I can't support somebody that's hurting that bad. And as I'm struggling here to provide that support and validation for that person, this tends to start increasing those levels of tension, increases the level of conflict, increases the level of anger and disagreements inside of the relationship. Trauma dumping here isn't conducive to building a relationship in a healthy manner. We can vent, but we can't dump. Because all we're seeking for at that point is emotional dependency, which creates imbalance. And that means if you're dumping consistently, that means your needs take precedence over anyone else's. And while I realize, and I say this quite often, relationships are not 50-50. They never are. A great balance, the closest we tend to get, 53-47, 55-45, that's a really healthy relationship. I know it sounds like, oh God, that's not close at all. Well, it is. Maybe somebody just brought an extra cup of coffee or somebody cooked an extra meal that week. And it can flip-flop too. But when we're looking at a relationship where there's something like this is consistently going on, you're then in the movement of where it's, this is 70, 80, 90% of the time, this person is monopolizing the entire conversation. Now, how do we recognize and maybe even address the signs of when this is happening? Now, we have to, when this begins happening in a relationship, this harmful behavior, we have to address it immediately. Now, there are going to be some common indicators here: repetitive sharing of our traumatic experiences. The person who's doing it doesn't seem to care about what we have to say at all. They don't even care that we don't want to listen, because maybe we've had a hard day and the last thing we want to hear is about somebody else's hard day. Or even their tendency to dominate conversations about their own problems over anything else. Now, these are just some of the patterns that, if we recognize them, it allows other people to intervene and maybe initiate and having a really calm conversation about communication dynamics with that person and explain to them. And it does take it takes a multi-leveled approach that allows that person to to know that, hey, look, it's okay, we understand. So there's going to be some mutual respect there, but we have to set some boundaries, because that keeps the interpersonal dynamics healthy. And it allows both individuals to assert their needs and limitations in conversations about trauma. By discussing these boundaries and expectations, both people can navigate these sensitive topics with greater sensitivity and understanding. Now, initiating open conversations about trauma dumping it's a difficult but crucial step in addressing this behavior and working on getting it to stop. And we have to do that with a little bit of empathy and compassion. And that way we create that space for dialogue and reflection, and we can encourage open and honest communication, active listening, which fosters mutual understanding, respect, and empathy, and it allows our relationship to grow and not stagnate. Oftentimes, it's really necessary, if somebody's, discussing a lot of heavy trauma, maybe to encourage them to seek professional help. This is where we get into doing therapy and we navigate those complex emotions as I do in my practice when I'm working with people through their trauma. It allows them to gain those insights into their behavior and cultivate a greater sense of self-awareness. And I try to empower people to break free from any destructive patterns and cultivate a healthier life for themselves. But no matter what you're going to do, and I'm going to talk about some healthy ways to do this, you've got to work on it yourself. You've got to work on it individually outside of the relationship. So if we're looking to do this, we have to understand, we have to be mindful of ourselves. We have to not be hard on ourselves. We have to even extend empathy to ourselves if we're the ones who are doing the trauma dumping. Some of these things are the pillars of how we lay the foundation for self-care and how we actually grow when we're hurting. Now, some of these techniques are really easy. Journaling. It creates a private space for you to process your emotions and reflect on your experiences. And with journaling, it can really gives you some clarity and insight into your own thoughts and feelings, and it allows you to express yourself in a manner that is constructive and is healthy. Another way you can deal with, when you're working with trauma, and by the way, these are just suggestions. I mean, you could, I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard before, but these are suggestions of things you can do. None of these things are, these combined maybe with therapy are great, or with these in combination together are all wonderful. You can engage in something creative, explore art or music or other creative activities. Maybe join a sports team, go start hiking. When you seek support, and we often see this as a cursory to aiding through this, when you go to seek support, it needs to be professional. Don't just start reaching back out to friends and family members Find somebody who can really help you, maybe even a support group. That's great. That's one way you can do it. Learn and practice active listening, especially if you're the one who's dumping, because what you're not hearing is what everybody else is saying. So you have to learn to hear others. And as I've mentioned this before, consider seeking professional therapy. I'm a trauma therapist. It's what I do. I do it day in and day out. I do it in the mornings with veterans, and I do it all, not everybody that sees me as therapy, but, has trauma, but that is some of the reasons, that's some of the main reasons why people see me. These are just some of the things that, we can do to understand trauma dumping, but it is a complex topic. But it's not healthy. And no matter how much you keep doing it, especially on social media, it's not going to make your situation better. It's going to constantly make it worse because you're going to have the reminders there. You're going to eventually have people who've read your story and it's impacted. They may come back to you in 3 or 4 weeks, ask you how you're doing about that particular topic, and guess what? That reignites the trauma all over again. So you're perpetuating the cycles here. Trauma dumping ultimately in social media isn't healthy. I tend not to engage when people are doing it. You're right if you want to occupy your space and that's what you want to use it for, but you have to ask yourself, if you've been doing it for years and you're constantly doing it and nothing has changed, nothing has gotten better, is all of that trauma dumping worth it? I'm going to suspect the answer is probably no. The only thing it's doing is getting you likes and sympathy and validating you, but ultimately you're now caught in a complete loop, because if you don't have that, it makes your situation worse. You withdraw, reignites those feelings, you start the pattern of the unhealthy pattern all over again, trauma dump again. Eventually, though, people get tired of reading the same things over and over from people, and they no longer click on those paragraphs because, you know what, John just keeps writing about it. This is John's 39th article on trauma, on his trauma that he's been, talking about for 2 years. Well, John, maybe it's not working. So I'm going to ask you all a question. I'm going to put this one up, and it's, typically where I don't go, but I think it's kind of quite valid. How do you all feel about people trauma dumping on social media? Do you think it's healthy? Do you support it? Do you like to listen? Do you shy away from it? I think it's a really big question, and it's worth considering because the amount of oversharing we're starting to see emotionally online definitely is starting to supplant the abilities, the people who are doing it, they are supplanting anybody else's boundaries, and they don't care that there's no consent there. And in our online interactions, maybe we should have some more care. But I'm really curious about this topic with you all. I'd like you to, if you follow me on social media, comment on this, comment on Spotify. Now, a couple quick things. Number one, my book is in stasis right now. I'm having problems with some of the formatting. Until I can get somebody to do it, the print version is temporarily suspended. So I'm sorry. I know it was promised to come out. The publisher came back to me. I'm not very good with that stuff. So I don't have the free time to edit my manuscript again. So it's going to be waiting. Number two, I've already mentioned this, and I'm really kind of getting excited about this. I have another podcast that I'm going to be launching. My target for the podcast now will be May. I will keep you all up to date. Now, I know that's about 30 days away. Chris is going to be taking you all into true crime. How does that kind of linger with what I'm doing here? Well, if you kind of figure the world I'm operating in, you'll kind of figure this out. So I'm going to give you a little bit more this week. I'm going to be taking you into true crime and BDSM. Okay? Because it does overlap. But with that said, I've already had one person reach out that is considering joining my team on a volunteer basis, and I've realized the scope of how big this is. So if you are interested in this field, if you're interested in this topic, and you want to, like to maybe lend me a hand, because I mean, not gonna lie, it's quite overwhelming for a one-man operation. Please reach out. You can get a hold of me through my email, thekinkperspectivealtogether@gmail.com. Let me know if you're interested. We can go from there. Yeah, it's really quite fascinating. It's all in development for now. But anyways, if this is the first time you're listening to me, please like, subscribe, yada yada yada. You know how we all do it on social media. Please rate my show 5 stars. This way, it allows me to keep this podcast free for what I'm doing for the community. The more likes I get, and the higher the rating goes, the more people can find it, and I can keep this free, and I'll keep doing it for free. I really don't want to turn this into like advertising or subscription based. I want to do this one for free. But again, let me know what your thoughts today, on the show, what you think about trauma dumping, and how that, if it's ever impacted your life. Let me know. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay